Welcome students to the series of lectures on the course Corporate Law. Now in this regard today we are going to discuss an important topic about dividends. And after we have discussed the topic dividends, you should be able to understand the following. Number one, what is a dividend? What is a dividend policy? You should be able to understand what are its various types. Who are entitled to receive dividends? The equity shareholders and the various classes of preference shareholders. What are various dividend theories? What is a dividend? Let us discuss this first. Dividend refers to a reward, cash or otherwise, that a company gives to its shareholders. Dividends can be issued in various forms, such as cash, payment, stocks, or any other form. A company's dividend is decided by its board of directors, and it requires the shareholders' approval. However, it is not obligatory for a company to pay dividend. Dividend is usually a part of the profit that the company shares with its shareholders. After paying its creditors, a company can use part or whole of the residual profits to reward its shareholders as dividends. However, when firms face cash shortage or when it needs cash for reinvestments, it can also skip paying dividends. When a company announces dividend, it also fixes a record date, and all shareholders who are registered as of that date become eligible to get dividend payout in proportion to their shareholding. The company usually mails the checks to shareholders within a week or so. In the US, some of the companies like Sun Microsystems, Cisco, and Oracle do not pay dividends and reinvest their total profit in the business itself. Dividend payment usually does not affect the fundamental value of a company's share price. Companies with high growth rate and at an early stage of their ventures rarely pay dividends, as they prefer to reinvest most of their profit to help sustain the higher growth and expansion. On the other hand, established companies try to offer regular dividends to reward loyal investors. Now let us discuss about dividend policy. 4 types of dividend policies are: number 1, the policy of the dividend distribution of a company dictates the number of dividends and the frequency at which the company pays to its shareholders. The company can follow different types of dividend policies related to the dividend. When the company earns profits, it has to decide how and where that profit will be utilized. The company can either retain profits earned or choose to distribute the same in the form of dividends to its shareholders. The 4 most prevalent types of dividend policies are: number 1, regular dividend policy; number 2, stable dividend policy; number 3, irregular dividend policy; and number 4, no dividend policy at all. Let us just discuss each one of them in detail. Regular dividend policy. Under this type of dividend policy, the company follows the procedure of paying out a dividend to its shareholders every year. If the company earns abnormal profits, then it retains the extra profit. Whereas if it remains in loss in any year, it also pays its shareholders a dividend. This type of policy is adopted by the company with stable earnings and steady cash flow. From the viewpoint of investors, a company paying regular dividends is low risk, despite the fact that the quantum of regular dividend might be small. Under this policy, the investors get dividends at a standard rate. The class of investors putting their investments into these companies is generally risk averse. They mainly belong to the retired or weaker sections of the society and aim at regular income. The company can only adopt this policy if it has a regular income. The main demerit of this policy is that investors cannot expect an increase in dividends even if the market is relatively booming. This type of policy helps us in creating confidence among the shareholders. It also helps us stabilize the market value of the shares, which increases the goodwill of the company. Now, the second is stable dividend policy. Under this type of dividend policy, the company pays out a fixed percentage of profits as dividends yearly. For example, suppose a company sets the payout rate at 10%. Then this profit percentage will be paid out as dividends every year, regardless of the quantum of profit. Whether a company makes a profit of 1 million or just 200,000, a fixed dividend rate will be paid out to the shareholders. In the eyes of investors, a company adopting this policy is risky. The reason being the amount of dividend fluctuates with the level of profit. In it, the company makes three components for its dividends. One part is a constant dividend per share, and the other is a constant payout ratio. And last is a stable rupee dividend plus extra dividend. The reserve fund created for this purpose pays a constant dividend per share. The target payout ratio defines a stable dividend policy. It also helps us stabilize the market value of shares in the same line as the regular dividend policy. Now, the third policy, irregular dividend policy. Under this type of dividend policy, the company states that it has no obligation to pay dividends to the shareholders. The board of directors will decide the quantum and rate of dividend. It depends upon the decision of the board of directors. The board might decide to distribute profits despite having low or no profit. It gains investors' confidence, and they will invest more in the company, and the company's liquidity will increase. In the eyes of the investors, company paying periodic dividends is considered risky. On the other hand, the company might retain all or significant amount of profit and distribute no or fewer dividends. The company may do this to increase the growth by using retained earnings. Moreover, companies with irregular cash flow and a lack of liquidity adopt this policy. The class of investors who are risk lovers prefers investing in this type of company. Now, the last policy is no dividend policy. Under this type of dividend policy, the company pays no dividend to its shareholders, irrespective of its profits or loss scenario. The payout ratio will be 0%. The company will retain the total earnings. It will reinvest into company's business model to expand it further with an increased rate and without hurtling into the issues like liquidity. The company gets funds through the earnings, which is the cheapest cost of financing. These policies are adopted by the company that is generally a startup or a company, say like Google or Facebook, who have already established trust among the investors. For startups, it helps expand their business, which will result in the overall growth of the business. The shareholders invest in the companies following no dividend policy with the aim that their total value of an investment will increase with the company's growth. For them, appreciation in share price is more important than the regular dividend. The class of investors investing in these companies generally belongs to younger or middle-aged groups that are not more dependent on regular income. Now we'll discuss about preference shareholders and its types, because that is very important here with regard to the dividends. Preference shares are those shares which carry a fixed charge. In other words, preference shares are paid dividend at a fixed rate. In certain senses, because of the fixed charge, these are equated with debt instruments. Preference shares are like senior citizens of a country who usually get preference almost everywhere. Like them, in an investment environment, the company issuing preference shares must pay a dividend to them before offering a single penny to equity shareholders. Similar is the situation in the event of bankruptcy. The residual money is used first to pay to the preference shareholders. Now, who are entitled to earnings? The first right on the earnings of the firms comes from secured creditors and unsecured creditors because they are outside liabilities. The interest accrued over a period of 1 year is paid to them. After the interest has been paid on outside liabilities, which may include loan from banks or other financial institutions, the remaining earnings are paid to the owners of the company, that is, various classes of shareholders. Here also we pay earnings in a chronological order. First of all types of preference shares are being paid. Whatever remains after that is being paid to the equity shareholders. Equity shareholders do not carry a fixed charge, whereas preference shareholders carry a fixed charge. Now we have types of preference shares. Let us discuss them. There are various types of preference shares with differences in their structure. Various types of preference shares are there in the market. The classification is on the basis of their different structure: maturity, the extent of participation, nature of dividend payment, etc. Number 1 is convertible and non-convertible preference shares. Number 2 is redeemable and irredeemable preference shares. Number 3 is participating and non-participating preference shares. And number 4th and last is cumulative and non-cumulative preference shares. So these are the 4 categories of preference shares. Now let us discuss each one of them one by one. Convertible and non-convertible preference shares. Convertible preference shares have a similar concept to convertible debentures. These shares possess an option or right whereby they can be converted into an ordinary share at some agreed terms and conditions. Non-convertible does not have this option, but all other normal characteristics of a preference share have. Now the example is here. For example, 15% 10,000 convertible preference shares of rupees 1,000 each. It means that these particular convertible shares are carrying a fixed charge of 15%. Now another is redeemable and irredeemable preference shares. A redeemable preference share is commonly seen as a preference share with a maturity date. The company will repay the capital amount to the preference shareholders on that date and discontinue the dividend payment thereon. Irredeemable preference shares are a little different from other types of preference shares. It does not have any maturity date, which makes this instrument very similar to equity, except that the dividend of these shares is fixed. They enjoy priority in paying both dividends and capital over the equity shares. Since there is an absence of maturity, they are also known as perpetual preference share capital. Now let us exemplify. How can this look like? Say 15% 10,000 redeemable preference shares of rupees 1,000 each. Now 15% dividend has to be paid here, and this will come to an amount which is equal to 1,50,000. So 1,50,000 is the fixed charge, it will have to be paid. Now another class of preference shares is participating and non-participating preference shares. Participating preference shares are a unique type of preference shares that has an additional benefit of participating in the company's profits apart from the fixed dividend. The distribution may depend on the terms and conditions mentioned in the agreement, which may vary to some extent from case to case. Other preference shares that do not participate are called non-participating preference shares. Unless it has been mentioned that preference shares are participating, it is assumed to be non-participating. And the example could be like this. 15%, 10,000 participative preference shares of rupees 1,000 each. Again, 15% is the fixed charge, and the amount which will come to these people, to these shareholders, will be 1,50,000 per annum. Now, the one more class of preference shares, that's called as cumulative and non-cumulative preference shares. If the shares are cumulative preference shares, the dividends are accumulated and therefore paid before anything is paid to equity shareholders. Even in liquidation, accumulated preference dividend and the preference share capital will be redeemed before any payment to equity shareholders. Whereas for non-cumulative preference shares, if a company does not pay the dividend in the current year, the claim of the preference shareholder is lost to that extent. Unless it is specified that preference shares are non-cumulative, it is assumed that it is cumulative in nature. Now, types of dividend. We will discuss the different types of dividend. If a company has decided to pay dividend to its shareholders, the next crucial decision it needs to make is the dividend payout ratio. Companies also need to decide what form of dividend they will pay out to the shareholders. There are 4 major types of dividends. Stock dividend is number 1. Dividends can be given in the form of granting additional shares to existing shareholders. Such shares are called as bonus shares. Another type of dividend is cash dividend. In cash dividend, the company pays a fixed amount per share to its shareholders. For example, if the dividend rate is 5% and you have 100 shares of the company, your cash dividend would be 5 into 100 rupees. That makes 500 rupees. Cash dividends are more popular than any other forms of dividends in India. There is another class of dividends that's called as property dividends. Sometimes a company issues a non-financial dividend to its shareholders, such as property dividend. These dividends can include giving shares of a subsidiary company, another company under parent brand, as dividends. The value of property dividend is considered against the current market price of the asset. Now, another class of dividend is called as scrip dividends. It's a promissory note indicating that the company will pay dividends to its shareholders later. These dividends are usually cash dividends. Interim and final dividends. A company pays an interim dividend before its profits are declared during its annual general meeting. Companies distribute interim dividend from their retained earnings. A company's retained earnings are the amount of profit left after paying direct and indirect costs and taxes. The final dividend, on the other hand, is paid after the company has declared its financial results. The company's board of directors declare the interim dividend and the final dividend. However, the final dividend is always annual. A company has the right to cancel the interim dividend once announced, but it cannot cancel the final dividend. Now, let us discuss about different dividend theories. On the relationship between dividend and the value of the firm, different theories have been advanced. Some of the major different theories of dividend in financial management are as: relevance theory is one category, and irrelevance theory. Now, under irrelevance theories, we have Miller and Modigliani hypothesis, which is popularly known as approach. Then, under relevance theory, we have dividends paid by firms which are viewed positively by investors. There are 2 models under relevance theory. One is Walters model and the second one is Gordon's model. The Walters model categorizes firms into 3 groups. Number 1, growth firms. Number 2, normal firms. And number 3, declining firms. Now, first of all, let us discuss about growth firms. There are several investment opportunities where firms can reinvest its earnings at a higher rate than the cost of capital which is expected by shareholders. We call it technically where R is the rate of return, is greater than the K means capital. Thus, the firm will maximize the value per share if the firm reinvests the earnings instead of rewarding of the earnings to its shareholders. Now, the normal firms. Regarding normal firms, when the firm finds that the internal rate of return from the investments is equal to the cost of capital expected by the shareholders, that means R, that is the required rate of return, is equal to the cost of capital, the status of the firm is normal and the firm cannot maximize its value by investing its earnings in investments. It makes no difference whether to invest the retained earnings or distribute the earnings as dividend among shareholders. Now, the last one is declining firms. It is a state of affairs when the the firm earns less from the investments from its retained earnings than the cost it has to bear on account of cost of capital. That means R, required rate of return, is less than the cost of capital. Under this scenario, the firm cannot grow and its status will be that of its retained earnings or not being reinvested as these bear less returns. Now, let us discuss dividend models. Let us first of all come to Walter's model, which is a part of the relevance theory. And then we will be also discussing about Gordon's model, which is again a part of the relevance theory. Then lastly, we will be discussing Modigliani and Miller hypothesis, which is a part of the irrelevance theory. Now, first of all, Walter's model. Walter's model shows a relation between the firm's rate of return, that is R, and its cost of capital, that is K. Professor James Walter argues that the choice of dividend policies almost always affects the value of the enterprise. His model shows clearly the importance of the relationship between the firm's internal rate of return, that is R, and its cost of capital, that is K, in determining the dividend policy that will maximize the wealth of the shareholders. The firm finances are all invested through retained earnings. As such, no debt or no new equity is issued for investments. The firm's internal rate of return and its cost of capital are constant. All earnings are either distributed as dividend or reinvested internally, immediately. Beginning earnings and dividends never change. The values of the earnings per share and the dividend per share may be changed in the model to determine the results, but any given values of earnings and dividends are assumed to remain constant forever in determining a given value. The firm has a very long or infinite life. This is depicted with the following formula, where market price MP is equal to DPS, dividend per share, divided by cost of capital, that is denoted by K, plus R, it is within the parenthesis, R stands for rate of return, into EPS, which is earnings per share, minus DPS, which is dividend per share. Again, it has to be divided by cost of capital, and then we close this whole and then again divided by cost of capital. Now, as I already told you, MP here stands for market price per share, DPS stands for dividend per share, EPS stands for earnings per share, R is the rate of return, and K is the cost of capital. Now, there is a criticism against this model. This criticism against Walter's model is like this, that Walter's model is quite useful to show the effects of dividend policy on all equity firms under different assumptions about the rate of return. However, the simplified nature of the model can lead to conclusions which are not true in general, though true for Walter's model. Now, the criticisms on Walter's model are as: number one, Walter's model of share valuation mixes dividend policy with investment policy of the firm. The model assumes that the investment opportunities of the firm are financed by the retained earnings only, and no external financing, debt or equity is used for the purpose when such a situation exists. Either the firm's investment or its dividend policy or both will be suboptimum. The wealth of the owners will maximize only when this optimum investment is made. Walter's model is based on the assumption that R, that is the required rate of return, your rate of return is constant. In fact, decreases as more investment occurs. This reflects the assumption that the most profitable investments are made first and then the poorer investments are made. The firm should step at a point where R is equal to K, meaning thereby the internal rate of return is equal to cost of capital. This is clearly an erroneous policy and failed to optimize the wealth of the owners. Number third, a firm's cost of capital or discount rate, that is K, does not remain constant. It changes directly with the firm's risk. Thus, the present value of the firm's income moves inversely with the cost of capital. By assuming that the discount rate K is constant, Walter's model abstracts from the effect of risk on the value of the firm. Number two is Gordon's model. One more popular model explicitly relating the market value of the firm to dividend policy is developed by Myron Gordon. Now, there are certain assumptions under Gordon's model. These are: number one, the firm is an all-equity firm. Number two, no external financing is available. Number three, the internal rate of return, that is R, of the firm is constant. Number four, the appropriate discount rate of the firm remains constant. Number fifth, the firm and its stream of earnings are perpetual. And number sixth assumption is the corporate taxes do not exist. One more assumption is the retention ratio, once decided upon, is constant. Thus, the growth rate, that is G, is equal to BR, is a constant forever. And number eight is that K is greater than BR, that is equal to G. If this condition is not fulfilled, we cannot get a meaningful value for the share. According to Gordon's dividend capitalization model, the market value of a share is equal to the present value of an infinite stream of dividends to be received by the shareholder. Thus, the above equation explicitly shows the relationship of current earnings, dividend policy, internal profitability, and all equity firms' cost of capital in the determination of value of the share. Number third is Modigliani and Miller hypothesis. Now, this is the irrelevance theory model. According to Modigliani and Miller, which is popularly known as hypothesis, the dividend policy of a firm is irrelevant as it does not affect the wealth of the shareholders. They argue that the value of the firm depends on the firm's earnings, which result from its investment policy. Thus, when the investment decision of the firm is given, dividend decision, the split of the earnings between dividends and retained earnings is of no significance in determining the value of the firm. Hypothesis is based on certain assumptions. These are: the firm operates in perfect capital market. Another assumption is taxes do not exist. Number third, the firm has a fixed investment policy. Number fourth assumption is risk of uncertainty does not exist. That is, investors are able to forecast future prices and dividends with certainty and one discount rate is appropriate for all securities and at all time periods. Under assumptions, R will be equal to the discount rate and identical for all shares. As a result, the price of each share must adjust so that the rate of return, which is composed of the rate of dividends and the capital gains on every share, will be equal to the discount rate and be identical for all shares. Now, there is a criticism against this dividend policy as well. Criticism is because of the unrealistic nature of the assumption, MM's hypothesis lacks practical relevance in the real world situation. Thus, it is being criticized on the following grounds. Number one, the assumption that taxes do not exist is far from reality. Number two, argued that the internal and external financing are equivalent. This cannot be true if the costs of floating new issues exist. Number three, according to MM's hypothesis, the wealth of a shareholder will be same whether the firm pays dividends or not. But because of the transaction costs and inconvenience associated with the sale of shares, to realize capital gains, shareholders prefer dividends to capital gains. Number fourth criticism is, even under the condition of certainty, it is not correct to assume that the discount rate should be same whether the firm uses the external or internal financing. If investors have desired to diversify their portfolios, the discount rate for external and internal financing will be different. The fifth criticism against this dividend policy is that argues that even if the assumption of perfect certainty is dropped and uncertainty is considered, dividend policy continues to be irrelevant. But according to the number of writers, dividends are relevant under conditions of uncertainty. So with this, we conclude today's discussion on dividends. I hope you have understood. Thank you very much.